to the Good Morning Show with Oliver O.T. Thomas.
We're back. Welcome back to the Good Morning Show. John Slade, Mr. Up to Date, co-host of Showtime. Man, thank you so much for your time and your talent. He always puts his spin and twist on the news. We appreciate that from John Slade. But we also appreciate our next guest, man. One of the leaders, I think, in criminal justice reform, prison reform right here in this country, but happens to be a professor of Loyola and research author, Dr. Andrea Armstrong. Thank you so much for taking time to come to the Good Morning Show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Well, we like people who like to be had, especially on the Good Morning Show. Doc, tell us about, first of all, who is Andrea Armstrong? Why her commitment to research and action on this issue? Why is that important? And give us a little background on what you do every day.
Well, I was born and raised here in New Orleans, left for school, and, I teach right now at Loyola. I teach constitutional law, criminal law, race and the law and poverty. And what I do in terms of prisons and jails is part of my research and part of my service and part of what I think is just critically important for black communities in particular.
But you, as an intellectual and academic, someone who teaches the next generation of thought leadership, you could have chosen another topic. You could have focused on another area of the law. Why become one of the leaders in this area?
So there's a couple of reasons. One is people don't talk about jail conditions. People assume that, whatever the conditions are, you must deserve it, right? And so everybody, when we talk about criminal justice reform, they talk about diversion on the front end or they talk about reentry on the back end, but they don't talk about what happens in the middle. And what happens in the middle is critical because those people come back home to us, right? And so we can't just ignore the conditions and the ways in which they live for months, years at a time.
Doc, I appreciate that. I've been that route. I understand. I spent a few years behind the wall, behind the fence. I know what it's like. I wrote a piece. When I came home, I gave a speech and offered my time at an institution. And I would tell people that, especially here in Louisiana, that once you go to prison, they should probably give everyone life sentences. And they were like, well, man, how could you say that? I said, well, because if the conditions are going to be what they are, if you're not going to invest in reentry, if you're not going to create conditions where I can reintegrate to society, then why would you let me come home? And I was being facetious, but I was also being honest in many cases of how the system actually causes worse conditions and worse mindset. There's a lot of mental angst and stress and trauma that they're creating inside these places and behind these walls where they just play it out on society when folk come home.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we have to understand that, you can design the most beautiful reentry program, but if you don't account for the 2 years of torture, that is not a weight that a reentry program can bear. But more broadly, I do also think that we are never the worst thing that we have ever done. Right? That is
Explain that. What do you mean?
So, we all do things that we're not proud of. All of us.
Right.
But we are so much more than that, right? So we, even people who have committed violent crimes, they are also fathers, mothers, workers, supporters. Right. They are parts of our community. And so even for the folks who are not coming home, they still deserve basic human dignity. And when jails strip people of that, we don't do anybody a service. In fact, we harm ourselves when we do that.
Well, now you wrote a critical piece that the data center that's been published, the impact of 300 years of jail conditions. Well, first of all, thank you so much. So much about 300. We're picking these sexy topics about historical contributions, landmarks, those things we celebrate. But Louisiana, with the New Orleans as the heartbeat of mass incarceration, it's been 300 years of the conditions that were created behind the wall.
Absolutely.
If you can talk about the social impact of those 300 years, what are some of the first things that come to mind?
The first is health, by far. So the New Orleans jail did not hire a full-time medical director until the 1990s. What that means is that for generations, They were exposed to different types of infectious diseases, poor treatment, et cetera, medical care, right? And so when people come back home and we look at medical health outcomes in communities and why, for example, particularly hard-hit communities, African Americans have worse health outcomes, higher rates of certain diseases,
Absolutely.
higher rates of, particularly around hearts, diabetes. Those are all
STDs
tied
are
to
transmitted in jail.
So between the neglect of medical care when people are incarcerated and the infectious diseases, none of which were caught prior to the 1990s because we didn't have a full-time medical director. That means that somebody's uncle, their father, their grandfather came home and brought that with them.
And one of the things I found out about the federal system and many systems is that they don't even have a doctor. Many have PAs. They have physician's assistants, folk who are from other countries who could not pass the medical exam. And these are the people who are examining folk behind bars and making recommendations.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow. 504-260-9265. A treat Dr. Andrea Armstrong. In her article and her research on the impact of 300 years of jail, the report. In doing this report and doing this study, if you could explain to our listening audience, why did Louisiana, how did we earn this number one ranking in the world in terms of per capita prison, treatment behind bars, recidivism, in every category? We not only lead the nation, but we lead many parts of the world.
Well, I think the first thing that we have to say outright is that it's clear that incarceration has not made us safer. It has not worked. And if the purpose is to make us safer, then we should be the safest state in the entire world.
No doubt about it.
Right. So that first goes without saying, but I think the other part of it is, part of it is our sentencing, right? So last year in Baton Rouge, we had the Justice Reinvestment Initiative. We had a package of 10 bills. And what we do is, for example, we have life without parole. We have one of the largest lifer populations per capita, right, because of the way that we sentence.
Absolutely.
So certainly part of it is our sentencing schemes. Part of it is what we choose to criminalize and what we don't choose to criminalize. And so our criminal code is a mess of different types of sentences.
The criminal codes are almost like black codes. When you study the kind of history there, I'll quote the DA from Calcasieu Parish, who said, yes, we know that these laws were developed because of slavery. We know that in many cases they're racist, but they're working. And then
was that St. Charles Parish?
St. Charles Parish.
DeRocher, the DA, said it is what it is about this non-unanimous jury.
And then the sheriff about reform when he said, man, but then why are they going to take our good inmates?
That was Cato.
That was Cato.
So this non-unanimous jury actually is a really big issue.
It is.
And it's coming up for a ballot election November 6th. It's a constitutional amendment. But when you look at the data that the advocate produced, right, one of the reasons we have one of the highest incarceration rates that we have, out of over 900 jury trials that they looked at, 400 of them were non-unanimous, meaning 400 of them would be invalid in 48 other states.
Wow.
Blacks are 30% more likely to be convicted by a non-unanimous jury than whites. And so the advocate did this incredible series, and so what we have in November is this opportunity to change that, to require a unanimous jury, just like almost every other state in the nation. And somehow their criminal justice systems are still functioning, right? So that is a huge opportunity for us to reduce our incarcerated populations, and also to reduce our, we're holding on. We're at number 2 in the world right now in terms of incarceration.
But isn't it a fact? I think it was Ralph Nader when he was saying, not Cuckoo Ralph, but when he was back several years ago, 30, 40 years ago, when he said that the criminal justice system would begin to bankrupt many communities in many states. Don't we see that here right now? We see the battle here with Louisiana. We had one of the largest. You called it a prison, but it should have been a city jail. Our state spends more money on their prison system than they do our flagship university.
Absolutely. So what we have is also somewhat unique here. We have in Louisiana a system where half of the state sentenced people are serving their time in local jails.
Mm-hmm.
And local jails are not designed for that function.
Explain that, because when I was talking about, we had like 7,700 people in parish prison system at one time in a city with less than 500,000 people. That's crazy.
That's absolutely correct. So pre-Katrina, and this happened particularly under Sheriff Fode's watch, we ballooned from a population of about 800 to a population of, there are estimates of 7,000 pre-Katrina. Part of that was the housing of state-sentenced prisoners. And so there was this per diem system in place where housing a state-sentenced prisoner brings the local sheriff a certain amount of money, which was more than the city was contributing.
That's right.
And so we had this population of 7,000, and I think we really have to appreciate the fact that today, or at least as of last week, we had a population of 1,277, which is a massive decrease. Doesn't mean that's all that we need to do, because given our crime rate, we should be at around 800, right? So there's a lot of work still to be done, and the racial inequities in the population still has to be addressed. But we do have to acknowledge that we've made some significant progress since Sheriff Fode's tenure.
Well, we're going to continue this conversation. We're talking to Dr. Andrea Armstrong, and her piece for the Tricentennial, The Impact of 300 Years of Jail Conditions, professor and research author at Loyola University. Let's get into conditions a little more. We talked about health and medical. We know that in the 80s and 90s, there was this move to take a lot of programs out of prison. People saw guys lifting weights and getting degrees and earning and learning trades. The conditions in some cases have gotten better, but in others are worse. Louisiana was known to have some of the bloodiest prison. Angola was called a bucket of blood at one point. Parish prison still has its challenges today. Talk about an effort to improve these conditions and where they stand right now.
Well, historically, what we've seen is that the primary response has been build a new building, right? A new facility. Right. And we have seen that over and over. And so one of the most interesting things in this project was that no one has ever documented the history of our jail here, right? And so from 1721 to our very first jail at Jackson Square, up to we built a new building at Congo when that, there was a fire, then there was another one built in 1794. Then they said, oh, well, the conditions are so horrible, we have to build a new jail. Right. So they went to Congo Square, and they built a jail there. And then the conditions, they were so horrible. So then they built another building over at Tulane and Broad to the point where pre-Katrina we had 10 different buildings operating.
Right. And then after Katrina.
And now we have a new building. But I think what this evidence in its 300 years shows is that building a new building is not enough. It is absolutely not enough. And so do we have, the types of problems that we had back in, the 1750s where there were extensive rat skeletons and vermins? Right. Let's hope not, right? I think, the new facility is a new building.
And we have federal oversight now.
Exactly. But what matters is how we treat people inside. And, less than a couple weeks ago, we had Miss Kentrell Hurst, who died during the detox protocol. Right? In 2017, we had 7 different people die as a result of their incarceration in the jail.
Being intact.
Suicide. We also have illness. We had a detox death. We had one who died actually from injuries sustained in 2012 when he was beaten by someone else in the jail. And so it is a deadly place, even in a new facility. And I think we have to keep that in mind moving forward.
The other topic of conversation when we talked about the prison system here was that the 500 beds for mentally ill. So how do you say we have mental patients with mental illness, and our first option is to expand the beds at the prison?
So this is something that, for people who care about what happens inside, it's a hard issue. Of course we want people to be treated for their mental health. For their mental health issues. And there's a study from a couple of years ago that said 50% of our jailed population has some diagnosed mental health condition. So that's really who we're dealing with. But I think it's a valid question of whether that should happen in a security custodial space versus in a public health space outside of the jail. And I think that's really
Great
the question.
point.
Nobody is saying that people shouldn't have mental health care, particularly for the acutely mentally ill. But the jail may not be the best place to house them.
I'd like you to ask this question because, we've dealt with this topic here before. We talk about it extensively. I'm involved in a lot of reentry stuff for the State Reentry Task Force, trying to assist and counsel young men and women who come through the system. Is as much as it was about race, given the number of black men, 1 in 3, now black women, 1 in 8, depending on which data you take a look at. Is it more about money now than even race? So,
in what sense?
Mass incarceration, locking people up, feeding the facilities. Is it more about investment in human capital and human suffering to fund those entities?
I think there's a certain part where...
Especially given Michelle Alexander's book and some of her research.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's helpful to be more precise about where we think the incentives and the economic incentives come from, right? So I think particularly in the reentry, the transitional work program space, there are very real questions to be asked about profit and investments, right? So if we have a private company, GEO, for example, has expanded beyond operating private facilities to actually supervision and reentry.
Workforce organization.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, by law, they can take 62% of any transitional work program salary, anybody who's enrolled in that program, and by law, they have to be paid minimum wage, right? And, or at least a comparable wage to those in the industry. And so there are real questions about that. But I think the other part, and the part that I really focus on in the research, is to think of our jail just like any other city institution, right? The jail is the same as our court system, as our school system. And so those all have sunken costs and investments. People want jobs. And so, yes, I think that there's some economic motives there, but I also think that the jail is functioning as intended, which is as a way to subordinate different marginalized communities.
Well, we're talking to Dr. Andrea Armstrong, one of our leaders in criminal justice reform and prison reform. A very profound piece she wrote for the Data Center for the Tricentennial. The impact of 300 years of jail conditions. We've talked about who she is, many of her efforts and topics here. When we come back, we're going to talk about this whole criminal justice reform, some of the pushback. How real is it? Are we going to continue to make some gains? And what are her ideas about offering solutions here so that we can have at least not only better conditions, but a better outcomes? OT and Dr. Armstrong will be back after the break.
You're listening to WBOK, New Orleans.
You're listening to The Good Morning Show with Oliver O.T. Thomas.
So we're back, 9:31 a.m. in the morning, and what a treat, OT in the early bird, sitting with Dr. Andrea Armstrong, professor, Loyola University research author, and the author of The Impact of 300 Years of Jail Conditions for the Tricentennial, produced and supported by the Data Center for Research here in New Orleans. Dr. Armstrong, again, thank you for your time and your talent. Thank you for dealing with this subject. It's a subject that, we'll talk about it, prisons and conditions and reforms, and we'll talk about it in terms of trends, and then many of the outcomes don't happen. All we see, like what's happening in the legislature, well, there's some pushback, right? There's some people that, even though there's a reform package moving through, we've made some gains, 10% for 10 years, 1% over 10 years. There are also many legislators who time and time again are trying to impact more mandatory minimums, stronger sentencing, even in the face of reform. How real is and sustainable is this effort that we're under right now?
This effort, you mean, to push criminal justice reform?
Absolutely.
So I think that what we have right now is an incredible moment and coalition of interests, right? And for very different reasons, right? So there are some people who have been fighting this fight. For example, Norris Henderson has been fighting this fight
absolutely
from Angola 30 years ago
right.
and has brought that work out here,
right?
But then there are others, and we saw this, last session with Louisiana Association of Business Industries, right? It was in their interest.
The Pelican Institute, MICA, many of those groups, absolutely. The late Kevin King.
The Koch brothers, right?
Yeah, the Koch, yeah.
And so we see this convergence, and it's really in these moments that we see movement. And the question is that movement going to be sustainable, or is it a one-off, right?
That's the question.
And so, I think part of what I learned in this research and that I've seen in the legislature is that where we have community engagement, community oversight, we actually see more sustainable changes.
Explain that, please.
So, for example, we passed this package last year, 10 different bills, and that very well could have been the end of it. But instead, I think it was actually a very wise choice. DOC decided to set up a JRI implementation council. And Norris is on that council.
Right.
Sarita Steib-Martin is on that council.
Right.
And they are there to make sure that the reinvestment happens and that the promises that were made are actually kept. Right? And so there are monthly meetings, there are briefings, there is data, and they are the ones who continue to hold the pressure on some of it. And without that, the attention shifts elsewhere. Lobby may have a completely different priority next session, but what we have structures in place with guaranteed community seating that is there to continue to ask the questions.
And we want to give some credit there, the work of Preskapikov, Jay LePere, Mike Cowan, and many others with Lobby and the Business Council. There has been a partnership in this effort.
Yes.
So the question is, how does it, how is it sustainable, especially given the conservative nature of Southern legislatures these days?
Well, I think part of it is to acknowledge that, yes, we may have a conservative legislature, but I think the other part is to say, Texas has a unanimous jury law.
Absolutely.
And they are just fine.
Great
Mississippi, Arkansas. And so we are an outlier even from the southern states. And what's the benefit of that? I'm not safer. I mean, are you safer?
No.
So I think that we can say, yes, everybody can have different political ideologies and actually different values around who does what and how we ascribe guilt. But at the same time, we are an outlier even for conservative southern states. And so, why is there more liberty in Texas than there is here in Louisiana?
Well, we had a whole host of callers earlier, but we're still dealing with a very important subject. We're talking to Dr. Andrea Armstrong, professor of law at the University of Loyola, research author. The impact of 300 years of jail conditions. Louisiana has relied so heavy on its prison population.
Yes.
They barter and bargain them out. They are on many of chain gangs, the history of chain gangs. Even here at Parish Prison, at one time they had a workforce
that is true.
That operated where the sheriff got paid. Angola right now has one of the top reentry programs in America, but most of the people there will never ever come home. How does, especially when you talk about conditions in reentry, how do we make reentry more meaningful, right? And how do we create reentry programs that are not just for folk who mostly will never ever reenter?
Well, first, I think programming is programming, right? And the guys who are up in Angola, they change and evolve, right?
Yes.
So with our lifer population, we've got close to 50% are 40 plus older.
Companies are hiring them to teach their own people. These men, many of them, they're not coming
very
home,
talented.
but they are very talented.
So I'm not mad about the fact that we actually have classes and programs for people that are incarcerated for the rest of their lives, right? Because there's a fantastic bill that came through this last legislature, which is about recognizing that people, while they may have committed crimes, may also be veterans, right? And it allows credit for serving veterans when they mentor an incoming veteran, right? So I think part of it is recognizing the talents and resources that we have. The other part of making reentry more sustainable is recognizing this fact that 50% of our population are in jails, and jails don't provide services, right? So 50% of the people who are coming back from conditions that are worse than Angola, right, that don't have the types of programming, classes, or even just the kind of getting in touch with how the world works again, right? They don't have that. And so I think we have to think about how do we move services and programming to the jail level, and what are the incentives for sheriffs to actually engage in that?
Let's talk about some of the realities there, especially because I've seen them, lived it, family members who have. There have been accounts, I know, where inmates have had a weapon, a firearm,
absolutely,
behind bars. I've seen where many young men, to survive, have had to prostitute or sell themselves. I was at a facility where if you set up a relationship with the guards, you could leave. Guys would ninja up and mass out through soft spots in the fences and in the wall. They were paid a certain amount, $25 for a certain amount of contraband, $50 for this, $75, $150 to bring drugs back in.
Absolutely.
Guys swapped gambling receipts, $10,000, $20,000 with their wives or girlfriends in the visiting room. People put hits on people in prison, and the system knows about it.
Absolutely. And not only does the system know about it, and sometimes the system facilitates it.
Absolutely.
Right? So when we create conditions of scarcity, we shouldn't be surprised how people try and survive. Right? And so another different part of my research is I'm an auditor certified by the Department of Justice around prisoner rape. And auditing facilities for how these types of things happen. What are the practices that a jail or prison can put into place to limit sexual assault and sexual harassment? And one of the most important things is when you put people in unsafe conditions, they will make choices that they wouldn't make if they were in a safer place. So improving the physical safety in general of the people who were there is going to reduce the types of things that you're talking about in terms of assault, and the need for contraband, particularly around shanks and weapons.
I want to deal with that because it's personal, and I'm familiar with one of my very best friends who's deceased now. And I know two incidents where a young man went to jail for manslaughter. He went to Angola. He was propositioned and told what he was going to have to do. He chose not to. So, the guys where we grew up told him, you got to handle your business. This guy is serious. So he killed the person. He was charged by the district attorney there. No one came and testified, said that he was threatened. He went from manslaughter to first degree murder. Then he became a predator. He killed 2 more people. He was housed in Camp J in extreme conditions. And he died in prison. He went there because he was in a fight. He defended himself. He would have been home in 6.5 years. He died 42 years later behind bars. There's another young man who grew up uptown who was a victim of an assault, rape. When he came home, he tried to shoot and kill anybody that ever got in his way.
Absolutely.
Those extreme cases were allowed to happen within the prison.
They were allowed to happen, and I think one of the things that we need to take away from that is that people will protect themselves. And we have to understand that unless they can trust that they are safe where they're at, right?
Even behind bars.
Even behind bars, especially behind bars. I do some work on some other jails and prisons, throughout the country.
Many of the jailers and the guards think it's a joke. They think it's just a way of life that happens behind the bar.
It's a joke even on movies, right? The dropping of the soap, right? How does the sexual assaulting of a person become a running joke or a gag? I mean, I think it speaks to how we have, as a culture, we think of people who are inside as inhumane, as non-human, and that is actually historically what jails have always done. So back in 1721, 1750s, our New Orleans jail, the guards were paid. They would get an extra fee for every whipping of a slave. And so here in New Orleans, you could send your slave to the jail for discipline, right? And so they would send their slave to the prison. The guards would get paid extra to whip them, and so they would gather them in groups of 30 and whip them as an entire group, right? That vision of who is in our jails has continued from the very beginning to now, right? And so it shouldn't be really a question that the people that are in there are us, right? They are our brothers, sisters, our aunts, our uncles, our friends, and they're not just some subhuman people, right?
Well, we're having a very in-depth conversation about the impact of 300 years of jail conditions, specifically here in what made Louisiana so different. You know, I've talked about drawing a line along the Mason-Dixie line, especially when you talk about the lives of black folk, whether it's poverty, access to quality education, criminal justice system, or the prison industrial complex. The numbers are so high in making it where the South, even though it happens all over the country, what happens in the South is at a whole nother level. What makes it so different here?
Well, I'm not sure that it's necessarily different, right? I think it's different in scope, right? Okay. So part of Louisiana is that we have very strong sheriffs and kind of parish systems vis-a-vis the capital, right? And so there are other states, for example, Connecticut, they have a unified system. All of their jails and prisons are part of one institution, right? Whereas here, I was just trying to count. I was just trying to figure out how many jails we have, and it was really hard to find an actual list. So I'm ending up manually counting with my finger, and I come up with at least 120 different jails, including
in this little state.
In this little state. Right, we've got our 64 parishes, but then there's different little facilities.
120 facilities in 64 parishes.
I mean, that's my count. It'd be great if we had an official list, though, wouldn't it?
Right.
I mean, so I think part of what I found...
It's kind of like the FBI non-statistics on the shootings of black men.
Exactly. So part of what I've been pushing for in this is greater transparency in how we operate our jails and prisons. Can we get some basic data about what we're doing? I want to know, right? So, for example, I maintain a spreadsheet, and there's another fantastic group, the Orleans Parish Prison Reform Coalition, also maintains it. Grows out of work that's been going on for decades in this city. But I should not be the one that can tell journalists how many people have died in our jail in the last 10 years. Our city, our state should be able to tell us how many people are dying. I'm looking at EBR at East Baton Rouge Parish Prison as well. Right. They should be able to provide at a minute's notice a list of the people who have died, how they have died, where in the facility they died, and why they died. Because that analysis is critical to preventing future deaths.
Dr. Armstrong, just a short time that I saw 6 people. 6 people. Saw one man change colors and die in his bed. Saw another young man who the physician's assistant, because they never sent a doctor, told him it was just stress, as he was losing 25 pounds a week. And then ultimately, when they finally diagnosed him cancer, was eating all of his internal organs after they prescribed ibuprofen for him, because they said nothing's really wrong with you. You're just stressed out about being here.
Well, I want us to think not just, so the lives lost are important, right? Because we are losing people who are a part of our community.
But people are still there.
But I also want to talk about the impact of a death that happens when other people who are detained and staff are exposed to the trauma of death and violence on a daily basis.
Talk about the impact of that. Brother Hakim Kashif, one of the workers with Ceasefire, does a lot of intervention. He told me about the first day he was sent to Three Rivers when he was given a 30-year sentence. Of course, he actually challenged the law to get 10-year reduction. He learned the law on his own. Absolutely. But his first day on the yard, when he watched someone get stabbed 74 times.
Yeah. We just had here in New Orleans that fantastic series around Central City, right? And what the exposure to violence does to a person. And think about, we've got people who are repeatedly exposed to that within these facilities, and it's not just, it's the people who work there as well, right? So I've visited a prison in California, and the guard stopped me to say, he said, well, is anybody in this group pregnant? And I was like, how is that relevant?
Right.
And he's like, well, if you were pregnant, we would tell you not to come in because the air quality and the violence and the trauma that is in this place is not appropriate. And I'm like, okay, you are in here every single day. How do you go home?
Great point.
After your shift working in this type of place?
We rarely hear that, Dr. Armstrong, the impact on the jailers. And what they bring outside to their families and to their kids. I've never heard anyone talk about that impact before.
Absolutely. I mean, so, think about, these are people who also have jobs, right? And this happens to be their job, and how hard of a job it is to involuntarily cage somebody. Can you imagine?
Right.
That being your job for 8 hours a day, at least if you're not pulling a double shift.
And many do double shifts.
Is to make sure that the people who don't want to be there stay caged. That is a hard task regardless. But then when you add to it these concerns about their own personal medical health, right? So, we have a mentally ill population that sometimes will spit on people, will throw things. And so you've got the staff who has their own concerns, like any other person, but they are also subject to these conditions, right? So improving jail conditions is not just trying to be soft or give a teddy bear, right? It is something that makes our community stronger because it empowers our staff to be healthier and also brings our people home in better condition than when they went.
I know the story of one New Orleans inmate who fathered 3 children while he was behind bars with 3 guards. So. Well,
I would consider that to be rape, right? Because the person who is incarcerated can't give consent given those power differentials.
Right. Wow. A real important conversation with Dr. Andrea Armstrong. Doc, you put in your report about the essay concludes the importance of, at the end of the day, community engagement and what we do with this type of data and information if we're going to continue to understand its impact. So in these last few minutes for our listening audience, what is their responsibility? How do we continue these reform efforts? And how do we, individually and collectively, how do we make a difference to support your research and what you do in terms of how we impact the conditions in prison?
I think we need to have a really strong and deep conversation about how do we have community oversight of one of the most closed institutions in our city. We would never allow this lack of non-transparency for our schools, for our hospitals, for any other city institution, but for some reason we allow it for the jail. And yes, the jail is under a consent decree, which has provided a small window, right, a monthly and sometimes quarterly window into the types of facilities that we have. But when that consent decree is over, what happens? Who is there then to continue to ask the questions, to continue to look? And so, I want us to think about what they've done in other jurisdictions, which is creating perhaps a community oversight board, an independent monitor. There are lots of different structures that we can build in to make sure that community has a window into the jail, because that's the only way that we're going to get continuing transparency on what happens.
Wow, Dr. Andrea Armstrong, the impact of the conditions, when you think about the conditions, what happens inside and behind those walls and inside the fences, ultimately has an impact on what happens when you're outside. And I think what people have to begin to realize is that most of the people are going to be released, and they're being released back to your family, your neighborhood, your city, your business, your community. So if they're not released in the best possible state of mind, then that's going to have an impact on how all of us live.
Absolutely. At a minimum, they should not be coming out worse off than when they went in.
Dr. Armstrong, we appreciate your time. You promised to come back as we continue to chronicle what happens in jail, out of jail, and a lot of this reform?
Absolutely.
No, we're going to take your word on that.
Absolutely.
This is OT and the Early Bird, man. We did our job to keep you up. And remember, if you're looking in the mirror, right, what happened to you may be somebody else's fault. But if you're looking at a mirror, if you don't see them, you may want to take care of it yourself. Chuck Perkins is coming back with the Conscious Hour, guys. Everybody have a wonderful day.